Ready to go? Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Maury Obstfeld. I'm the C. Fred Bergston Senior Fellow here. I am doing this introduction in Adam Posen's place because he is sadly caught in the Washington, D.C. morning traffic. But we're very happy to have this great event on the real turning point for Germany, economic and security implications of the Merz chancellorship. We've got two fantastic speakers who will present, and then we'll be in conversation with Adam when he finally gets here. First up will be Moritz Schularick. He's president of the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany. He's been in that role since June 2023. He's also professor of economics at Sciences Po in Paris. His research covers financial markets, monetary and macroeconomics, financial crises, political economy, and inequality. Before coming to Kiel, Moritz was professor of macroeconomics at the University of Bonn, director of the macro finance lab there. He's also a fellow of the DFG Excellence Cluster, a full member of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Academy Europaea. He previously had positions and conducted research at NYU, Cambridge University, the Freie University in Berlin, and in the research department at the New York Fed. Our second speaker is Kori Schake, who is a senior fellow at our neighbor across the street, the American Enterprise Institute. She's also the director of foreign and defense policy studies at AEI. And before moving there, Dr. Schake was deputy director general of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's had a distinguished career in government as well, working at the US State Department, the Defense Department, and the National Security Council in the White House. In addition, she's taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins SACE, another neighbor, the National Defense University, and the University of Maryland. With that, I'll turn it over to Moritz, and we'll dive into the program.
Good morning. Thank you, Maury. And I want to thank the Peterson Institute and President Adam Posen for the hospitality on this clearly important day in international economics. I want to talk about the real Zeitenwende, the real change in German policy and policy making that has taken place in recent weeks. And I want to give you an idea about the coming Friedrich Merz chancellorship in these times. So Friedrich Merz is Germany's likely new chancellor. He started after the election by essentially quoting Mario Draghi and saying whatever it takes, and referred to the security and economic challenges that the country faces. As you will have heard, one of the first steps was to, in a somewhat unusual maneuver, change the constitution, change Germany's constitution that had a constitutional debt break, meaning very strict borrowing limits for the federal and the Länder, the regional governments, changed that constitution still with the old parliament before the new parliament after the election had convened. That maneuver was motivated by the very big and impactful changes in the security landscape that have obviously also to do with the events and the change in the administration over here. Let me give you a quick idea what actually has been agreed. The constitution has been changed. Things are in place now, and the new parliament has actually convened for the first time last week. So Germany, if you remember, after 2008, after the global financial crisis, introduced a very strict debt brake, constitutional borrowing limit into its constitution, the Grundgesetz. That debt brake has now been lifted in two important ways. First, there is a one-off special purpose vehicle, if you want, a so-called Sondervermögen, an infrastructure fund of 500 billion euros over the next 12 years that is supposed, and we have had a debate in the country about the additionality of the investments, but it's now been also clarified that these additional investments on top of what's already been planned into the country's ailing infrastructure. So everything from railways, roads, bridges, but also obviously the digital infrastructure and hopefully research and development infrastructure. 100 billion of these 500 billion are earmarked for the Länder, for the regions, and another 100 billion are specifically targeted. That was a deal with the outgoing government, a green coalition partner of the outgoing government, for the energy transformation. If you think about this, Germany is a 4.5 trillion euro economy, so this is a little more than 10% of GDP. Over 12 years, you divide this by 12, it's also a nominal number, so inflation will erode quite some of that over time. We're clearly talking about a fiscal impulse, but the large number, especially if you think about the time horizon, shrinks, and I'll give you some numbers in a second, but we're probably looking at something around 0.6, 0.7% of GDP, additional infrastructure spending over the next decade. The bigger and in many ways more meaningful and more really game-changing introduction and change of the constitution is that the debt brake has been examined now. Defense and security spendings are no longer subject to borrowing limits above 1% of GDP. So there's no limit, no upper limit here. The discussion in Germany is that over the next few years, the country will have to approach levels of defense spending seen in other European countries and in the US, 3.5% maybe of GDP. So you can think here that a 2.5% of additional borrowing, once the new sort of security strategy and is rolled out, will be in the cards. On the Länder side, there is a small point I want to tell you. The Länder now, they also had a debt brake and they have a little bit more room for maneuver, 0.35% of GDP. That's not that much, but there is more flexibility in all these accounts. If you put them together, it was about 40 billion per year that we expect in additional infrastructure spending. Defense, if you broadly say we're going to cover the difference between 1 and 3.5% of GDP, we'll spend another 110 billion on defense per year. Länder debt limit is another 15 billion. So in total, new borrowing, the additional deficit that we'll talk about will likely amount to somewhere around 150, 160 billion per year. And think about Germany now running essentially budget or general government deficits, I should say, of roughly 3.5% of GDP. Going forward, I know for American standards, that's still a very attractively low number. But of course, for Germany, after a very strict fiscal course over the past 15 years or so, it is a major change. What does this mean for debt to GDP ratios? Well, obviously, a lot depends on the assumptions, how well the money is spent, how well the economy performs otherwise. If you, in a low nominal growth scenario, so this includes inflation of 2.5% and some reasonable assumptions for interest rates, the debt to GDP ratio could reach 75% by 2030. In a scenario that's more, in my view, probably more likely over the next few years, again, if you count on some boost from the additional investment and some boost from the defense spending, and the debt to GDP ratio could reach 70%. These are still numbers that I think that's a debate that in Germany it might be more attractive and more hot than in other countries. These are still numbers that don't put fiscal solvency in jeopardy. Financial markets, we put this piece out in Merz We Trust. Right after financial markets were happy and applauded the package in various ways. Clearly, the German yield curve steepened, but at the same time, both the stock market and the euro appreciated. So there's very little to this day in the financial market data that indicates that we are talking about that the market's perception of German solvency or fiscal risk have changed. There is an increase in real yields and growth expectations. As a Kiel Institute, we say this, we've also upgraded our growth forecast in response to these big changes in fiscal policy. We now think we have 1.5% real growth next year. If you add 2.5% inflation, we'll talk about an economy that grows again at 4% nominally next year. That is something that you see these very tepid and numbers here over the last few years that the country hasn't seen after 3 years of stagnation. And particularly equipment investment, I suppose, is forecast to pick up again, something that's clearly needed. Again, look at these very large negative numbers over the last 3 years. Probably the best and the most direct expression of the structural headwinds that Germany faced in terms of investment, technology adoption, etc. Potential growth is, of course, the key question, especially if you look at the productivity performance. I know that's a point that Adam has made also very forcefully in the past. Productivity performance was dismal in the past few years. So just look at that period before 2024, the black, white, the diagonals are productivity growth in a very classic decomposition of the growth drivers of the German economy had slowed down to basically zero. We assume some increase, and I'll talk about this in a second, also coming from especially the R&D and high-tech part of the defense buildup. But the big headwind, you see the blue bars, they're going negative very sharply in a few years from now, is the demographic headwinds. We're losing labor force, and unless there is conscious policies to turn this around through skilled immigration into the labor market, Germany will, at least in this simple decomposition sense, start every year with a minus before the decimal because of shrinking labor force. Let's turn to what is the real game changer, namely Germany after 70 years of seeing itself as essentially a civil, non-military power, has decided that this is the time to rearm. It's something that we at the Kiel Institute have, with our contributions to the Munich Security Conference and others, we've led the conversation on this in the past 2 years. What I show you here is the evolution of defense and social spending since the formation of the Federal Republic in 1949, since the early 50s. The blue line being the decrease in military expenditures, basically down to 1%, which incidentally was roughly the level that the Versailles Treaty after World War I prescribed for the Weimar Republic in terms of defense spending. Social expenditures, that have increased dramatically at the same point. There's also a geopolitical risk index that gives you an idea that clearly if Matteo here at the Fed is right about the riskiness of this environment, and I have zero doubt that he is, we have not, until very recently, not heard the message in increased defense spending. If you look at the international comparison, you see Germany is at 1.2% of GDP from the regular budget. We had already had one special purpose fund of 100 billion that was legislated in 2022. That brings us to the 2% sort of informal NATO goal. Mind you, as many other countries, but Germany is also is also guilty of that. There are all kinds of numbers that are reported to NATO. The German numbers also include things such as a children's allowance for soldiers that don't necessarily contribute to a fighting force. But that is going to go up now substantially. You see the 1.2, so everything about 1% of GDP is now exempt from the debt brake. And that, of course, is, I think, from an economic point of view, the big, no other area. I told you about the Sondervermögen, the special purpose fund for infrastructure, which is comparatively small. In no other area Germany will spend and invest as much in the coming decade as in the area of defense. And that has, of course, there's an opportunity here, an economic opportunity. Let me say very clearly, this is not why the country does it. It does it because of the security environment and the new the new analysis of the threats from the East and the uncertain support from the West, if I can put it this way. The academic literature sees spending multipliers. So the question, what happens if the government spends an additional 100 billion on defense? What happens to GDP? Sees these multipliers around in a range from 0.6 to 1.5. So to some extent, the defense spending will be self-financing, although likely not fully. What matters is how you spend it. So the Financial Times weekend edition is relevant for defense here as well. How do you want to spend it? You want to spend it domestically, and I think that's something that everyone in Europe has understood. That shopping in the American weapons supermarket is maybe a short-term fix, but it's not a long-term strategy if you want to reap the economic benefits of additional defense investment. And the multipliers are large if and when the high-tech R&D component is big, so that you get the spillovers into the civilian sectors, into possibly closing Europe's and especially Germany's technological gap towards the US and arguably China over the medium run. More in this report if you're interested in. Let me close by saying, well, in this, if we get this growth boost, what could possibly go wrong? Well, one thing that could go wrong is that the international environment continues to deteriorate. We're meeting here today on a day where some decisions will be announced, or some new effects will reach us. At the Kiel Institute, we run a quantitative trade model. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with these models. They have their limitations, they have their strength. But if we model a 25% blanket import tariff that the US implements, maybe it's a 20%, then you want to see this as an upper limit. The short-run changes in production will hit the German economy most strongly among the European economies. So we think about 0.4, 0.5%. It's probably lower limit because these models are typically frictionless and not particularly assume that most of the business cycle sort of second round effects can be stabilized away. But you also see that, of course, the economic effect on the US is getting large. We are going from a world in which effective tariffs were in the range of 2 to 3% to a world where across the board a 20 or 25% tariff is, if that ever sees the day and if it becomes reality, the economic effects become really large. And they become large, and here was my last point on this. If you look at what this means for domestic prices, actually our models tend to have a problem because these things get quite non-linear very quickly at these. We just haven't seen tariffs of that magnitude in recent decades. So I would definitely be like a little bit careful, but we've checked this with other similar models. These quantitative trade models signal that the price effects, the domestic price effects for the US of a 25% across the board tariff will be significant. Maybe it's not 8%, as I show you here. Maybe it's more in the 4 or 5% range, but it's no longer a negligible rounding effect in the overall price picture. I think that's for sure. A side effect, obviously, is deflation in Europe, because all these goods that no longer go to the US will have to be sold in other parts and partly domestically, and to entice that, prices will have to fall. So the ECB here has arguably some work to do on the interest rate side if the price effect is that. So this is all without retaliation. If you look at the effect with retaliation, that assumes retaliation of everyone, including the Chinese, etc. The GDP effects double both for the US. They don't increase all that much for Europe, but here the assumption obviously is that there is a sort of united retaliation of all these countries. I'll leave it here, maybe with a last word on what the outlook for the Merz chancellorship is going to be. I think his key task, and I think he understands that very well, is that he has to keep Europe together in this new environment, which will not be an easy task. But on the fiscal side, domestically, he certainly has the means now to cooperate with the French, with the Poles, on reorganizing European defense. And given the fiscal backdrop that his new government now has, it's at least an opportunity both on the infrastructure side and on the defense side to reinvigorate both on technological and on the sort of infrastructure level a German economy that has suffered now for almost half a decade from chronic underinvestment and a very low growth dynamism. So the big risk is obviously that the international situation deteriorates to a degree where the open and very strongly integrated German economy takes a bigger hit. But for now, I think I feel myself agreeing largely with the financial market assessment of the first weeks of the non-government. Remember, we don't have a government yet, and things could still fall apart in the coalition talks. An unlikely scenario, if I can add that, because all the parties involved, the two involved parties, are very well aware that they have to come to an agreement. But if the international situation remains does not sort of completely derail that, it's if not a new dawn, but certainly again a time of economic opportunity, and obviously one where Germany at the right time with, if I may say, unusual speed has set the foundations to at least be a meaningful political and economic actor in this new environment. I'll leave it here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, that is an intimidatingly smart presentation to have to follow. And the only reason, and I anticipated it would be, and the only reason I agreed to try and follow it, first of all, I always show up for Adam Posen because he's amazing. And second of all, I'm an enormous fan of the defense work that the Kiel Institute does, the way they have been tracking assistance to Ukraine and other fundamental data and analysis that all of the rest of us rely on. So thank you for somebody who doesn't follow the economics. I'm a huge fan and consumer of the work that the Institute does. What I thought I might try and do is two things. First, think a little bit with you about whether the conditions that produced this major change in German direction are likely to hold. And second, what the changes may mean across the Atlantic and among the Europeans. So first, whether the conditions will hold. Well, the two major conditions that produce the big change in German direction are, first of all, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if I may suggest a little bit of guilt on the part of Germany that after Russia's initial invasion in 2014, that the diplomatic process actually disadvantaged Ukraine's ability to continue defending itself. But watching Russia's 2022 invasion and the course of the war in the last 3 years, there is a tendency, and I think you see it in European defense spending from 2022 to now, a tendency to think that not only has Russia upended the security framework of Europe, but that Russia's success in Ukraine will lead to more aggressive Russian pressure on Western Europe. That's the drive for Poland's defense increase, which is headed to 5%. It's the impetus for Sweden and Finland to become NATO members. It's the impetus for Germany to commit to permanent stationing of German forces in the Baltic states, Britain likewise. But it seems to me possible that we are overestimating the threat that Russia poses for Europe. Because to turn the kaleidoscope a little bit, Ukraine, which has a smaller Soviet-style military than Russia's Soviet-style military, has fought Russia largely to a standstill across the last 3 years. Now, they had a lot of help in weaponry, but they still fought Russia on their own to a rough standstill. And it seems to me that a Russia that can barely hold its own against Ukraine is unlikely to be successful and maybe even to be ambitious to take a swing at Poland, Finland, or the Baltic states, given that the Baltic states are now reinforced by other European and American allies. So it seems to me possible that we are overstating the threat that Russia poses. And as the Ukraine war plays out, if Ukraine can continue to hold its own, that may diminish anxiety over time, not just among Europeans, but also among North Americans, about the threat that Russia poses. Moreover, if the prospect for Russian failure in Ukraine increases, either because of instability in the Russian economic program for supporting the war, or because Vladimir Putin gets fearful about continued conscription. You know, they still aren't conscripting troops from the major Russian cities. And that should tell us something about where Russia sees its own vulnerabilities. So one potential change in the support for the direction the Merz government is taking is potential diminished anxiety over time about the threat Russia poses to Europe and beyond. And the second possibility, the second discontinuity and motive for the change is, of course, the collapse of confidence by America's European allies that the United States is a reliable or trustworthy security partner. That, I sadly believe, is likely to be the problem of a generation, because I think the first Trump term really shook. I mean, it's clear he believes alliances are a fundamental burden rather than benefit for the United States. And in a first term, NATO allies navigated that quite adroitly. The re-election of Donald Trump, I think, caused America's allies to believe that this is a fundamental change in direction on the part of the United States. And the choices of the Trump administration in the first 3 months of its second term, the Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference, the Zelensky Oval Office meeting, the erratic nature of the president's threats to Canada, to Greenland, to Panama, I think have justifiably made America's closest friends fear not just that the United States isn't a reliable partner, but that we have actually joined the axis of adversaries to the security of Europe. And the rebuilding of trust will be a generational, in fact, if the United States can and chooses to restore the confidence of the transatlantic security bargain, that's going to take a lot of time. And in the meantime, I think what we will be seeing is a continuation of the trends. Europeans funding their own defense more, deepening cooperation, especially among the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Poland, and maybe Finland, in defense. Discussions about nuclear proliferation and nuclear sharing arrangements to ensure extended nuclear deterrence if the American deterrent becomes even more unreliable. And indigenous weapons production, probably to include investment by European countries into defense industry in Ukraine, where there's so much interesting innovation going on that European firms may choose to build factories and share intellectual property southward and eastward rather than across the Atlantic. And maybe the last thing I would suggest might might derail the direction that the Merz government is on is, the burden sharing debate we have been having across the Atlantic, we are now going to see internal to Europe. Because if Poland's spending 5% and Germany's spending close to that, how is it that Spain can call for a European army but not contribute to it? Or pressure on Italy, Spain, and Portugal to increase their own defense spending is something that taxpayers in Germany would understandably want to press for, and could cause fracturing of the unification of Europe's defense efforts in a way we haven't anticipated, and could make more difficult the continuation of this program. So I think all three of those prospects could shift the line on those graphs, and we should be thinking about ways that the Merz government can be supported by other Europeans and perhaps by North Americans if the Trump administration, as the New York Times suggests this morning, begins to realize that the United States actually needs help for things it is trying to do in the world, and it's collapsing the prospect of that help.
You want to go in the middle or?
Good morning, everyone. Maury Obstfeld has not suddenly gained weight. I am Adam Posen, president of the Institute, and I was a minute late arriving, and I'm grateful to Maury for welcoming our very distinguished guests. Moritz and Kori, I want to be very clear, are not only genuine intellectual leaders and policy leaders across the Atlantic, but are people who I personally have enormous regard for each of them. Kori has been a voice of truth and principle in very challenging times, and she has not hesitated to make that clear compellingly, as she just did for us. And Moritz, having taken over leadership of the legendary Kiel Institute for Weltwirtschaft, has been an exemplary think tank leader. I'm beginning to wonder if I can keep up in making his team's contributions incredibly timely, relevant, while rigorous, at a time, obviously, when things are really up for grabs in Germany and Europe. And the ability of Kiel, as Kori mentioned, to contribute on the issues of Ukraine, of military spending, on the issues of fiscal policy in Germany and beyond in real time has been extraordinary. So I commend you and your team. I'm going to ask a couple questions and then turn it over to our audience, live audience, for further discussion. Let me start with just a small question, Moritz. You set out very clearly it looked like a 3+% increment in debt. You also set out a multiplier that is at least 0.6 and might even be higher than 1 if we believe some of the other issues go in. So to me, there was a couple steps missing why your growth numbers and your debt numbers don't go up more than they do. So is it that you don't get to the 3%? It's a very straightforward question. Just is it you don't get to the 3% expansion in debt for a few years? Is it that there are offsetting effects you didn't define? It seems like there's a gap there. So could you just spell that out, please?
Happy to. So, I mean, obviously the ramp up in defense spending is not going to be immediate over the next year. So we think we're going to go maybe 3% in 27 and increasing to 3.5 after that. But then, as you say, there's a bunch of additional assumptions. We basically assume that the interest rate on debt remains where it is now, which is below 3%. That hasn't increased much, and we'll get, if the ECB, remains credible with the inflation target, we looking at an economy that's growing again at 3.5% nominal rate, and probably in the baseline scenario. So, with a 3.5% deficit number going forward, you don't get huge increases in the debt to GDP ratio. There is, I think, obviously the big uncertainties is the course of interest rates. It's also generally the course of growth, and clearly what we're seeing in the international economy with the trade and tariff uncertainties is not helping. But I think as soon as you're willing to assume some positive effect from that additional spending, some GDP growth, you don't get to debt to GDP. Now, we're starting now at 62 or something, or 63. So it's not an increase that.
I'm not German. I'm not worried about it. I just want to understand.
Germans, the worry is obviously if you hear this number of 500 billion, everyone thinks this means that we're going back to Weimar Germany and hyperinflation. No, it's especially if you think about the 12-year horizon, that the infrastructure package is probably quite modest actually, and the defense spending is the part where, based on our work that you've mentioned, Ethan Mierzetsky from the LSE did a great paper for us. I have reasonable hopes that the multipliers are not meaningfully below one.
Let me go from that to a slightly more conceptual economic issue, and then bring Kori back in to talk about the core issue we're on today. Economically, you remain, but before the focus of the last couple of years, were very much a macroeconomist. A number of us here at the Peterson Institute, including Maury, Olivier Blanchard, Jean Pisani-Ferry, myself, spent a lot of years fighting with previous generations of German policymakers to respond differently, manage their fiscal policy differently, increase investment. Obviously, having a Russian gun staring you in the face is a good way to concentrate. But could you say a bit more about how you think the overall German economic system may change as a result of this? Is this just something that sort of happens in its own area? You get investment and spending on defense, and some auto sales you lose in China and the US, you put people there. Or does this change in fiscal policy change other things about the German economy?
Right. So maybe let me start with a quick anecdote. There were 4 economists that actually played a role in sort of hatching out this package, which was, it was always clear for me, not only that I believed in the importance, but that the conservative opposition in the political sense to lifting or changing the debt brake in the area of defense was not sustainable. They had to move. It was the election campaign, statements that you could do everything that needs to be done to defend Europe by cutting a little bit on the social budget was, at least in the short run, never credible. And I think the arguments to the debt brake is a means to an end, and the end is to live in freedom and security and prosperity in Europe. It's not an end in itself. And I think that argument was very strong. That's also why we've pushed it so strongly from the Kiel Institute, just saying this is obviously our foreign and security policy interest, but it's also a reason why the debt brake can't be in the way of that economically. It doesn't make sense. So what happens now is a big question. I mean, I've tried to give you a little bit of a positive spin on what could happen. It is clear that the traditional industries are still in a big transformation. And there's now the possibility that sectors, and I would say, and this is a point I know we've discussed a lot in the past, Adam, that the fact that Germany is sort of one of probably the best at the technologies of the last century, but not the best at the technologies of this century, that you can close that gap because so much of that defense and military spending that now needs to be done in a coordinated way on a European level will be exactly in the areas where Germany is traditionally weak. So the talk now is about Europe, Germany needing, I guess, let's use the word of Manhattan projects. Now, one is going to be clearly the satellite constellation, the dependence on American Starlink, et cetera, is seen as a major vulnerability. The second is the scaling up of drone networked, AI-powered autonomous systems, where especially the German side was very, very cautious in the past, saying like we don't want like robots to fight wars of the future. That has changed with what Kori mentioned, like the rapid technological advancements in Ukraine. So that's number two. The number three is, I think, a big European public good, an Iron Dome, with all that, with all the rockets and space capabilities that are linked to that. And fourth, which I'm not going to go because I'm not an expert, I'm more here to learn, is of course the nuclear question. But if you look at the first three, like the autonomous systems, the AI part, the rocket system, and sort of the whole satellite constellations, we're talking about high-tech sectors where this country hasn't had a 1-2%, or maybe not all of this will go there, but let's say 1% of GDP investment boost for a sustained period. That's where my hope comes from, that this is more transformational than, just substituting a little bit for declining car industry. Because we do have, that's something I'm convinced of. We do have the researchers, we do have the human capital, even in the AI space. A lot of these sort of original AI ideas are, Europeans are always involved, right. But now there is never been the scale actually to, and I guess also the mindset to really say we have to do it at home. And I notice in my conversations, especially with the European tech community, there is something new in the air, which is we no longer want to be treated by the Americans as a second world. We're going to show you we can do it here.
Kori, let me pull you in. And again, thank you for coming across the street figuratively as well as geographically to broaden our conversation. So I'll reverse what I did to Moritz. First, a bit of a conceptual question or big picture question. So from your view, and you gave us a very realistic assessment of the sustainability of these German changes in German trends on the outside forces. From your point of view, to achieve a credible deterrent to Russia, or to achieve a credible, to use a French term, strategic autonomy from the US, is spending enough? Are there other things that either German or NATO ex-US or EU defense has to do? And from the American perspective, Trump or people of good faith who are Atlanticists, what else would the Americans want besides the more spending? Because the more spending's been the ask for so long.
So because we have been having the burden sharing debate within the NATO alliance so vociferously for about 15, 20 years now, what that has caused is a collapse of confidence on the part of Europeans that they can do anything without American participation. And it's just not true. We act as though European militaries couldn't fight without American assistance. They couldn't fight the way we plan to fight now without American assistance. But we shouldn't have any doubt of the strength of European militaries relative to who they're going to fight, right? Like the Russians were fought to a standstill by Ukraine. They would lose fighting Poland. They would lose fighting France. They would lose fighting Finland. And pretty soon they would lose fighting Germany, much less in those countries in collection. So I think we do our European allies a disservice by suggesting that unless they do it the way we would do it, right, highly networked and autonomous targeting, for example, and lots of expendables, lots of expensive platforms that are webbed with expendables now, and intensive communications and intelligence feeds into operations, right? Europe can't do that without us, but we shouldn't doubt that they can do enough to defeat anybody they were going to fight. So I think there are things they need to do, but we are overstating what those things are because we're comparing them to how they would fight with us instead of them figuring out how to fight without us. And on the, I think we already see the dawning realization on the Trump administration that behaving in the way they are behaving is actually not going to produce cooperation. It's actually not going to produce continued reliance on American industries, including the defense industry. And they seem, I mean, they're such bad strategists, right? Like they seem to think that nobody but us has freedom of action.
Right.
And what I notice as a policymaker who's had to do coalition warfare stuff since the mid-1990s is that we assume that if we step back, others will step forward. And what actually happens is when we step back, everybody else steps back further. And the Trump administration has assumed and continues to assume that America's friends and allies, if confronted with American abandonment, will nonetheless make the choices we wanted them to make. And that's actually not going to happen. They're going to make choices that might not be in their interests and might not be in our interests because they lack confidence they can do things without us.
Thank you very much, Kori. Given that today is Orwellian day of restriction means liberation and unilateralism means reciprocity, I have to point out that I and a number of Peterson colleagues have been making a similar argument on the trade side, that there is this perception that the US has, in a sense, to use the security term, escalation dominance in trade conflict, that if somebody retaliates, US can quickly retaliate more, and so it all goes away, rather than what you said, if we're stepping back, they step back. So there are powerful resonances here. With that, again, given Liberation is not Freedom Day, let me ask both of you. Kori brought up something I think is very important, which is very short order. For self-interested reasons, for threat assessment reasons, for enlightened strategic reasons, Germany and Europe are going to spend money more at home and less on American defense systems, are going to try to develop an indigenous military capacity. You've obviously both thought a lot about this. How does this play out? How does this play out in terms of US retaliation? How does this play out in terms of which industries and which systems, to some degree, not nitty-gritty line item, but building on what Moritz was saying about their 4 Manhattan projects, what are the prospects for maintaining enough to deter or respond to Russia versus the sort of understandable aspirational, we don't want to be a number 2, we want to be in AI, we want to be in drones like the US. Just, it's a lot of issues, but but as you say, this is going to come up very quickly, the allocation of spending between US and European weapon systems. How do you see this playing out? Maybe I'll start with Moritz.
Great question. Maybe if I can quickly react to Kori, I absolutely agree with what you said. There is one element that I think in Europe and in Germany especially is debated in terms of Ukraine, which is, you're totally right about Ukraine holding Russia back, but by far the most expensive way to defend Europe would be to let Russia win in Ukraine, take over all that, not only the land, but also the technological potential, that armament industry that has, and the defense tech industry that has grown so much, and then defend /and/or deter a much stronger Russia. So I think that's point number one. Point number two that we've also been pointed out in a report is Russia having changed to a war economy and producing, at this rapid clip, traditional weaponry, right? Tanks and artillery and ammunition. That doesn't really change the balance of power so much as of now because Ukraine destroys so much of that new production. But the moment there's peace in Ukraine, these Russian numbers, production numbers go up very fast, and Europe has not yet responded. So I know for a fact that the numbers are that the Russian military industry right now, for many of the main armed systems and like tanks and artilleries and planes, produces basically the entire stock of the German military within 3 months right now. So the flow is so much larger than the stock, and we haven't really. So I mean, this is part of we really need to get into expanding industrial capacity, and I think then also the unit costs will come down. I mean, we've seen this come out when you start from hand manufacturing individual rockets to going to industrial scale production of these things, the productivity gains are realized. I do think that there is, so this is not to your question, Adam, I do sense that the decision makers, Friedrich Merz and the team around him, is aware that there's a trade-off between what's available in the very short run to beef up European defense. Think about air defense, the Patriots, etc. And also basically Israeli equipment as well, obviously. And what is desirable in terms of increasing both the technological capabilities at home and giving the economic benefit. Then the economic benefits of buying, F-35s for Europe are minimal. Of course, there's some maintenance and stuff, but it's not really interesting from an economic point of view. And they will go down that route. I think the French are in a very strong position right now because they've always had this position of saying we need to have autonomy in certain areas, especially as the Brits now discover that their nuclear deterrence is also not quite independent of the US. So they're in a strong position. I think they will continue to press for homegrown European investment. Of course, as economists would say, why don't you cooperate? And that's the first best. But I think after the images out of the White House with Zelensky and the banned speech in Munich, these Manhattan projects...
And the signal breach.
Yeah. And the signal, yes, exactly. I think it's very clear that of these four Manhattan projects, if you include the tactical and nuclear capabilities, the idea will be to be independent from the US in those.
Great.
If I were a European government, that's exactly what I would do. Right? The United States has threatened our treaty allies with doing what we have done to Ukraine, shutting off weapons supplies, shutting off intelligence sharing. That makes us fundamentally unreliable. And Europeans standing together can actually shift this balance very quickly. My understanding is that Europe produces terrific tanks, it produces terrific ships, it produces terrific airplanes. The missile defenses is an area of great American advantage over European production. But the US isn't the only model on this, right? The Israeli Iron Dome works pretty well and put on the forward edges of potential battle areas, even on the scale of European geography, could be incredibly helpful. Also, Europeans, even if you don't go for complete European autonomy, can easily go for non-American autonomy, right? The Polish choice on buying from South Korea, Australia, Japan, there are non-American alternatives that can help Europe very quickly level the playing field against what the United States provides.
Thank you, Kori. This has all been on the record. It's going out live around the world. And of course, the video and associated materials will be available to everyone on our website, www.PIIE.com. Obviously, if AEI or Kiel wishes to cross-post, we'd love it. Let me now turn to our in-person distinguished audience. If anyone would like to ask a question, please, Jessica will bring you the traveling mic. If you could identify yourself, please.
Peter Rashish from the American German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Morris, I wanted to ask, to what extent is the German investment program either dependent on, or at least to what extent would it be helped by more actions at the European Union level with regard to the single market, not just in the defense, but in areas like capital markets or energy?
A very important point, I think, especially in the areas of basically startup financing, high-tech venture financing. The lack of depth of capital market in Europe has been a tremendous obstacle to more rapid progress and scaling up of these startups. I hope that with the new commission now we'll finally make progress, and this is, maybe the opportunity that is in crisis, that there's now much bigger fish to fry, in a way, much bigger problems to solve than worrying about the resistance of local savings banks to completing capital market union. I hope we can move ahead quite fast on this. The general direction that Europe needs to come together to be strong and be united to be strong, be it in trade, be it in defense, be it in sort of the forms of financing for innovation and realizing also the economies of scale in industries and areas of telecommunications, etc. I think that is now standard and widely shared sort of standard opinion in Europe, in Germany as well. That doesn't mean that, all these players can delay and make things hard, but there is, I haven't heard people worry about banking union and the future of Italian deposits anymore in a long time. So I think the direction of travel is clear. The question now also, obviously big change also in the German finance ministry coming. I mean, we haven't talked about this, but it looks very likely that the Social Democrats are going to take the finance ministry. So some of these like traditional, call them Ordo, objections to more risk sharing on the Eurozone because of fear of some more hazard. I think that trade-off, which is still there, there's no denying there is a trade-off between risk sharing and moral hazard to some extent, but I think it will tilt more to the other side of saying this is the benefits of Europe coming together and sharing risk.
Thank you. Another question, please, from the audience. Really? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. If you could identify yourself, please.
Charles Enoch, formerly from the IMF and University of Oxford. How do you see the role of the United Kingdom in this? And that Starmer seems still to be dithering between closer to Europe and still maintaining links to the US. I mean, how important is the UK in that, and how do you see the UK moving towards this pan-European model? Thanks.
So I'm sympathetic to the position Starmer's in, because since the Blair government in the 1990s, the British defense strategy has been explicitly predicated on the assumption that the British military would never fight unless it were fighting alongside the United States. And the British nuclear deterrent fundamentally relies on American support, maintenance, and so whether the British nuclear deterrent could be extended to Europe over American opposition, I think, is the second question Starmer has to really wrestle with. So I'm not surprised he's trying to, what's that great British phrase, cakeism?
Yes.
He's trying not to have to decide between these things. And hoping that Britain can be a bridge to a difficult and intractable United States in ways that are sufficiently advantageous to Europe that other Europeans tolerate that continued reliance. I'd say he has about a prospect of about 3 in 10 of pulling that off.
Looking like a true economist, putting odds on things. We're coming to the end of our time. Okay, one more question if we can get it in, please.
Thank you. David Blash, I'm speaking in my personal capacity.
Where are you employed?
Sorry?
Where are you employed?
IMF, but I'm speaking.
That's fine, but we need
personally.
both.
It's a question about the debate in Germany, because this German shift in policy was very surprising, and it is even surprisingly very good on every aspect. Does it reflect a new mindset in Germany, or was it led by the next chancellor? Because it is such a radical change in fiscal terms, in terms of global leadership, in military terms. Is there support? And I've been very disappointed that I couldn't find much on the debate in Germany on these new policies.
Thank you.
Right. Let me try to answer this briefly, although it's a big and excellent complex question. I do think that until recently, if you ask the German leading politician, and and you said like a setting like us on a talk show or on a panel, and then afterwards you would have a drink and say, what do you really think? And you keep on pressing and pressing and you know, sort of taking layer of layer of layer, there would be two core convictions that would always come through, and that would explain also, if you think about Chancellor Scholz's hesitation, you know, I mean, just to give you the stat, we're economists here, German military support for Ukraine over the years equaled 0.1% of your German GDP. It was a total macroeconomic rounding number that he still somehow used to, you know, turn into a public debate. In the first Gulf War, Helmut Kohl wrote a check to the Americans, which was like 7-8 times as much in a single year, and no one complained about it. So there was a clear policy choice driven by a hesitation, you know, to talk about what is a rounding error in the federal budget and the 4.5 trillion economy into a political dispute. But if you took off the different layers, there were two core convictions. One was that the Russians actually don't want to come after anyone else but Ukraine. And deep conviction number two was that in case of doubt, you always have the Americans. And if you put these two together, there was always a good excuse for not doing much, for just doing yet enough to signal something cheaply to the White House with the first Sondervermögen, but actually never pulling the trigger or turning the switch, which they didn't do after February 22. They, you know, randomly allocated some money to buy some things, but it wasn't like a clear strategic plan to change this is what you mean. This plan is now there. And it has changed on both sides. It has changed because there's a new and I think much more realistic and correct assessment of Putin. And there's a very clear sense of, how would I say it, not betrayal maybe, but disappointment and uncertainty, whether you can still rely in all scenarios on Trump. And I think the sentiment in Europe is now, if Putin was to attack a Baltic state tomorrow, Europe could not necessarily count on the Americans to defend the Baltics. And those two things have changed, and I think that's why you perceive this now with the speed that was really incredibly fast, I agree. Merz has understood that and came forward, and he is also, this maybe the last word on this, I know I have to have a look at the time, but the Merz, don't forget, he is like still a 1990s Helmut Kohl, Wolfgang Schäuble, European, like old school European politician. So he had this instinct very right that this is the moment where Europe has to come together, and Germany, as after the fall of the war with the Maastricht Treaty, the introduction of the euro has to be in the lead, and that's why I said in the talk earlier, that's his big task, and I know he knows that, is to keep Europe together in this new environment and even push it further in terms of integration, in terms of European Defense Union, and go ahead.
Thank you. Just a couple notes, if I may. I first met Friedrich Merz in December 1990 in Berlin in a transatlantic young leaders contest. I'm sure the incoming chancellor does not remember me, but just to echo what Moritz is saying, but more importantly, to make a broad point that the co-founder of our institute, Fred Burston, always made, and the many people, including our colleague Mac Dessler, who sadly just passed away the other day, always made. In the US, in many places, foreign policy drives economic policy. Oftentimes, part of why we had a coalition for trade, for relations with Europe and the US, was in Congress because of transatlanticism, because of foreign policy, even if it made economic sense, it was for that reason. And as many people have argued, including Jacob Kierkegaard and I in a report to the European Commission 6 years ago, common perception of military threat was probably the way forward for European unification. That doesn't mean we can count on it. It's a much more nuanced, sophisticated issue, as Moritz and Kori have set out. But the idea that global geopolitical developments are ultimately what pushes this is something that not only is familiar to people in the policy space, but should be familiar to people in the historical political economy space. With that, I just want to do a plug. This event is the start of our spring busy season at the Peterson Institute, heading into the spring IMF World Bank G20 meetings period. Given the probable lack of, let us say, decisive cooperation in those venues, I think what comes out of the Peterson Institute is likely to be more interesting than some of the official statements. And on this theme of Europe, just let me promote, Anjali Bhatt and Elena Rybakova are going to be talking tomorrow on PIIE Insider Live about economic statecraft and the Russia-Ukraine war. A week from now, on April 15th, Karen Dynan will be leading our Global Economic Prospects with Chad Bown on trade, but importantly, Jacob Kierkegaard on the Transformation Europe, a different but not so different perspective from Moritz. We'll be launching on April 16th the new book on the new economic nationalism by Monica DeBole, Mahdi Sarsabayev, and Jeremy Cohen-Seton. And on April 17th, I'll be leading a virtual discussion live with Olivier Blanchard and Lawrence Summers on the macroeconomic impact of the new US international policies. Then during Spring Week, we'll have Klaas Knot, the governor of the Netherlands Bank and the chair of the Financial Stability Board, talking about monetary policy and the euro in an uncertain world. On April 24th, Maury Obstfeld, Warwick McKibben, and I, and a distinguished person to be named shortly, are going to be talking about whether changing the trade regime changes the dollar regime. And finally, of this run, on April 25th, we'll have here live our colleagues Olivier Blanchard, Cecilia Malmström, and another person from a different place across the street, Constanze Stelzenmüller, to talk about Europe's future in 3D, fiscal, trade, and defense. We could not have gotten off to a better start, though, than to have our two distinguished colleagues, Moritz Schularick, the director of the Kiel Institute for Weltwirtschaft, and Kori Schake, the director of foreign policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute, with us today on the real turning point for Germany. On the day of liberation, let us talk about genuine liberating of the mind and keeping Europe free. So thank you very much.
Thank you.